A lonely rancher hid a native girl from raiders. At sunrise, her tribe surrounded his land without a sound. The silence was what woke him. After 30 years on the frontier, Daniel Hartwell knew that absolute quiet in the wilderness meant only one thing: he was being watched. As he stepped onto his porch in the pre-dawn darkness, he could feel hundreds of eyes upon him, though he could see nothing but shadows among the cottonwoods that bordered his ranch. Somewhere in his barn, hidden beneath hay bales and horse blankets, lay the reason for this ghostly gathering. The young woman he had protected through the night would either be his salvation or his doom when the sun finally rose over the New Mexico territory. Daniel had built his ranch in the high desert 30 miles south of Santa Fe, where the Sangre de Cristo Mountains painted purple silhouettes against endless skies. At 52, he had spent the last 15 years carving a life from the harsh but beautiful landscape, raising cattle that thrived on the sparse grass, and building a reputation for fairness that extended to all his neighbors, regardless of the color of their skin or the language they spoke. The ranch house was modest but solid, built from adobe bricks and pine timber cut from the nearby mountains. A wide portal wrapped around the front, providing shade during the scorching summer months and protection from winter winds. Behind the house stood a barn large enough for 20 horses, a bunkhouse that had rarely been used since his ranch hands left for better opportunities in California, and corrals that could hold 300 head of cattle. Daniel had chosen this isolated location deliberately. After losing his wife and 2 sons to cholera during their journey west, he had wanted nothing more than solitude and the chance to rebuild his shattered life. The work was hard but honest, and the land demanded everything he could give while offering just enough in return to keep him going. Over the years, he had found a kind of peace in the rhythm of ranch life, though the loneliness sometimes threatened to consume him entirely. His relationship with the local Pueblo and Apache bands had been carefully cultivated through years of respectful interaction. Daniel spoke enough Spanish and rudimentary Apache to conduct basic conversations, and he had always honored the traditional hunting and gathering rights that predated his legal claim to the land. When tribal members needed shelter during storms or medical attention for injuries, his door was always open. In return, they had helped him during difficult times, sharing knowledge about the land and its resources that no amount of book learning could provide. The events that led to this morning of silence had begun 3 days earlier, when Daniel discovered the aftermath of what appeared to be a raid on a small Apache camp hidden in the mountains above his ranch. He had been tracking a missing calf when he stumbled upon the scattered remains of wickiups and the cold ashes of cooking fires. Most disturbing were the signs of struggle and the presence of shod hoofprints that did not belong to tribal horses. Daniel knew that tensions between settlers and various Apache bands had been escalating throughout the territory. The discovery of silver in the nearby mountains had brought a flood of prospectors and opportunists, many of whom viewed the indigenous population as obstacles to be removed rather than neighbors to be respected. Stories of attacks and counterattacks filled the newspapers, though Daniel had learned to be skeptical of such reports, knowing how quickly fear and prejudice could transform minor incidents into tales of wholesale slaughter. As he examined the abandoned camp, Daniel heard a sound that made his blood run cold. Somewhere in the brush below, someone was crying with the desperate, exhausted sobs of a person who had reached the limits of human endurance. Moving carefully through the scattered rocks and stunted pinon pines, he found her hiding in a shallow cave that provided minimal shelter from the elements. She appeared to be about 19 years old, with long black hair matted with dirt and blood. Her traditional dress was torn and stained, and her feet were bare and cut from running over rough ground. Most alarming was the deep gash on her left shoulder, which had been bleeding for some time and showed signs of infection. She looked up at Daniel with eyes that held equal measures of defiance and despair, clearly expecting the worst from this encounter with a white man. "I will not hurt you," Daniel said in his limited Apache, holding his hands out to show they were empty. "You are injured. Let me help." The young woman studied his face for a long moment, perhaps recognizing something in his expression that gave her hope. When she tried to stand, her legs buckled, and Daniel caught her before she could fall. Up close, he could see that she was burning with fever and desperately dehydrated. "Water," she whispered in English, surprising him with her knowledge of the language. Daniel gave her water from his canteen, supporting her as she drank in small, careful sips. When her immediate thirst was satisfied, he helped her onto his horse and began the careful journey back to his ranch. She drifted in and out of consciousness during the ride, sometimes speaking in Apache and sometimes in English, but always with an urgency that suggested she was reliving recent traumatic events. Back at the ranch, Daniel carried the young woman into his house and settled her on the couch near the fireplace. Her fever was dangerously high, and the wound on her shoulder needed immediate attention. Drawing on the medical knowledge he had acquired during his years of isolation, Daniel cleaned the injury as gently as possible and applied a poultice made from plants that his Pueblo neighbors had taught him to use for healing. As he worked, the young woman opened her eyes and looked at him with surprising clarity. "Why are you helping me?" she asked in carefully pronounced English. "Because you need help," Daniel replied simply. "What is your name?" "Ayana," she said. "It means eternal blossom in my language. That is a beautiful name. I am Daniel Hartwell. This is my ranch, and you are safe here." Ayana struggled to sit up, wincing as the movement pulled at her injured shoulder. "You do not understand. They will come looking for me. The men who attacked our camp, they took my sister and 2 other girls. I escaped, but they will not stop searching until they find me." "Who were they?" Daniel asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "White men with guns and ropes. They said they were collecting bounties, but they were interested in more than just reward money. My sister is only 16 and beautiful. They looked at her the way wolves look at sheep." Daniel felt a familiar rage building in his chest. He had encountered such men before, criminals who used the chaos of frontier life to pursue their own twisted desires while hiding behind claims of law enforcement or Indian fighting. They were a plague on the territory, making life dangerous for everyone while giving legitimate settlers a bad reputation among the tribal communities. "How many were there?" Daniel asked. 6 men, well-armed and mounted on good horses. Their leader was a big man with yellow hair and scars on his face. He spoke as if he knew these mountains well. The description sounded familiar to Daniel, though he could not immediately place where he might have encountered such a person. What mattered now was keeping Ayana safe while her fever broke and her wound began to heal. Everything else could wait until she was strong enough to make decisions about her own future. Over the next 2 days, Daniel nursed Ayana back to health with the patience and gentleness he had once shown his own children. He prepared nourishing broths and herbal teas, changed her bandages regularly, and sat with her during the worst of her fever dreams. Slowly, her strength returned, and with it came a determination to find and rescue her sister. "I must go back to find them," Ayana said on the 2nd evening, as she sat up in bed for the first time since arriving at the ranch. "You are not strong enough yet," Daniel replied. "And even if you were, 6 armed men are too many for one person to handle alone." "Then what do you suggest?" Ayana asked, frustration evident in her voice. "That I abandon my sister to those animals?" Daniel had been thinking about this problem since learning about the kidnapping. "I suggest we find your people and ask for their help. 6 men may be too many for 1 or 2 people, but they would not stand a chance against a well-organized tribal war party." "My people are scattered," Ayana said sadly. "The attack on our camp was the 3rd this month. Many families have fled to Mexico or to the reservations in Arizona. I do not even know if any of our warriors are still in this area." "There is only one way to find out," Daniel said. "I know how to contact the tribal leaders. If any of your people are nearby, they will come when they learn what has happened." That night, Daniel built a signal fire on the highest point of his property, using the traditional pattern of smoke signals that his Apache neighbors had taught him years earlier. The message was simple but urgent. A friend needed to speak with tribal leaders about a matter of great importance. He kept the fire burning all night, adding green branches at regular intervals to maintain the distinctive smoke pattern that would be visible for miles in the clear desert air. The response came more quickly than Daniel had expected. Just before dawn on the 3rd day, as he stepped onto his porch to check the horizon, he felt the weight of unseen observation pressing down upon him like a physical force. The normal sounds of morning birds and insects had vanished, replaced by a silence so complete it seemed to echo in his ears. Daniel knew better than to make any sudden movements. Instead, he walked slowly to the center of his yard and stood with his arms at his sides, waiting for whoever was watching him to make the first move. The sun was just beginning to touch the peaks of the distant mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "Daniel Hartwell," came a voice from the shadows near the barn. "You have sent word that you wish to speak with us." The speaker emerged from concealment with the fluid grace of someone who had spent a lifetime moving silently through dangerous territory. He was a man of perhaps 45 years, with graying hair and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. Daniel recognized him as Swift Eagle, a respected war chief who had always maintained cordial relations with the white ranchers in the area. "Swift Eagle," Daniel said, inclining his head respectfully. "Thank you for coming so quickly." "Your message suggested urgency," Swift Eagle replied. "What has happened that requires our attention?" Before Daniel could answer, other figures began emerging from concealment all around the ranch. They appeared from behind buildings, from within the corral, from the shadows of trees, and from depressions in the ground that Daniel would have sworn were empty moments before. Within minutes, he counted at least 50 warriors, all armed and clearly prepared for whatever situation they might encounter. "You have been busy," Daniel said, trying to keep his voice light despite the seriousness of the situation. "We have been watching your ranch since you lit the signal fire," Swift Eagle explained. "We wanted to be certain this was not a trap before revealing ourselves." "And what have you concluded?" Swift Eagle smiled slightly. "That you are either the most foolish white man in the territory or the most honorable. Given our past dealings, I am inclined to believe the latter." Daniel gestured toward his house. "I have someone here that you need to meet. Someone who can tell you about crimes that have been committed against your people." Swift Eagle's expression grew serious. "Show us." Daniel led the war chief and 2 of his lieutenants into the house, where Ayanna was waiting in the main room. She had insisted on dressing and preparing herself to meet her rescuers, despite Daniel's concerns about her still healing injuries. When she saw Swift Eagle, her face lit up with relief and recognition. "Uncle," she said, using the term of respect for an elder rather than indicating actual family relationship. "I feared that all our warriors had been driven away." "Ayanna," Swift Eagle said, his voice filled with emotion as he recognized the young woman. "We heard about the attack on your camp. We feared the worst when we could not find any survivors." "I escaped," Ayanna said simply, "but they took my sister Kaya and 2 other girls. This man saved my life and has been caring for me." Swift Eagle turned to Daniel with new respect in his eyes. "You have done a great service for our people. How can we repay this debt?" "Help her find her sister," Daniel said without hesitation. 6 men took the girls 3 days ago. They cannot have gotten far with captives to slow them down." "Describe these men," Swift Eagle commanded, his voice taking on the hard edge of a leader preparing for war. Ayanna provided a detailed description of the attackers, including their weapons, horses, and the distinctive appearance of their leader. As she spoke, Daniel noticed several of the warriors exchanging meaningful glances. "You know these men," Daniel observed. "We know their type," Swift Eagle replied grimly. "There have been several such bands operating in the territory, claiming to hunt hostile Indians while actually pursuing their own criminal goals. This particular group sounds like one that has been active near the mining camps to the north." "Then you can find them?" "We can find them," Swift Eagle confirmed. "But first, we must discuss what role you will play in this matter." Daniel looked puzzled. "I do not understand." "You have shown great courage and honor in protecting Ayanna," Swift Eagle explained. "But you have also put yourself in danger. These men will not forget that one of their targets escaped, and they may come looking for her here. If you wish, we can take her to safety with our people, and you can return to your normal life." "And if I do not wish that?" Daniel asked. Swift Eagle studied his face carefully. "Then you become part of this fight, with all the risks that entails. These are dangerous men who will not hesitate to hurt anyone who stands in their way." Daniel looked at Ayanna, seeing the hope and determination in her eyes. He thought about his quiet, solitary life on the ranch, and about the 15 years he had spent trying to heal from his own losses. Then he thought about the young woman who had trusted him enough to accept his help, and about her sister who was still in the hands of criminals. "I am already part of this fight," he said firmly. "These men committed crimes on my land and against people under my protection. I will not rest until they face justice." Swift Eagle nodded approvingly. Then we will plan together. But first you should know that we have been watching these raiders for several days. They have made camp in the old mining settlement of Copper Creek, about 20 miles north of here. They believe they are safe there, because the mines were abandoned years ago. How many men do you have? Daniel asked. More than enough, Swift Eagle replied with a grim smile. Word of these attacks has spread throughout the territory. Warriors from several bands have come together to deal with this threat. We number nearly 100 all-experienced fighters who understand the importance of this mission. Daniel whistled softly. It was an impressive force, more than sufficient to deal with 6 criminals no matter how well armed they might be. But he also understood that such a large gathering of warriors would attract attention from the territorial authorities, potentially creating new problems even as it solved the immediate crisis. What about the territorial government? Daniel asked. If word gets out that 100 Apache warriors have banded together, there will be panic in every settlement from here to Santa Fe. That is why we must act quickly and quietly, Swift Eagle explained. We will rescue the captives, deal with the criminals, and disperse before anyone realizes what has happened. With luck, the authorities will assume the raiders simply moved on to other territories. The plan that emerged from their discussions was elegant in its simplicity. The war party would surround the abandoned mining camp during the night, cutting off all escape routes. At dawn, a small group would approach openly under a flag of truce, offering to trade for the release of the captives. If the criminals agreed to negotiate, the warriors would attempt to secure the girls' freedom through peaceful means. If they refused or tried to use the captives as human shields, the surrounding force would close in from all sides. Daniel's role would be to accompany the negotiation party, lending credibility to their offer while providing a witness who could testify to the territorial authorities that any violence that occurred was in self-defense. It was a dangerous assignment, but one that played to his strengths as someone who was respected by both communities. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the warriors began their preparations for the mission. Daniel was impressed by their organization and discipline, qualities that contradicted the savage stereotypes promoted by many frontier newspapers. These were professional soldiers preparing for a military operation, not a bloodthirsty mob seeking random violence. Ayana insisted on joining the rescue party, despite Daniel's concerns about her recent injuries. Kaya is my sister, she said firmly. She will be frightened and confused. She needs to see a familiar face to know that she is truly safe. Swift Eagle supported her decision, though he insisted that she remain with the reserves until the initial contact was complete. If the negotiations went well, she could come forward to help comfort the rescued captives. If fighting broke out, she would be protected by a guard of experienced warriors. As the war party prepared to depart, Swift Eagle took Daniel aside for a private conversation. I want you to understand what you are risking, the war chief said seriously. If this mission goes wrong, if any of my warriors are killed, or if innocent settlers are harmed, you will share responsibility for the consequences. The territorial authorities will not care that you were trying to help. They will see only that you aided Apache warriors in an armed action. I understand the risks, Daniel replied, but I also understand that doing nothing is not an option. Those girls deserve to be rescued, and their captors deserve to face justice. Even if that justice comes from Apache warriors rather than American courts? Daniel considered the question carefully. I have lived on this frontier long enough to know that sometimes formal justice is not available. When it is not, we must create our own. Swift Eagle nodded approvingly. Then we understand each other. Let us go bring these girls home. The journey to Copper Creek took most of the day, with the war party moving in small groups to avoid detection. Daniel rode with Swift Eagle and the advance scouts, marveling at their ability to navigate the rough terrain while leaving virtually no trail behind them. It was a masterful display of wilderness skills that reminded him how much he still had to learn about this land, despite his 15 years of residence. They reached the vicinity of the mining camp just as the sun was setting behind the western mountains. From a ridge overlooking the settlement, Daniel could see smoke rising from several buildings and horses grazing in a makeshift corral. The raiders had chosen their hideout well, selecting a position that offered good visibility of the surrounding approaches while providing multiple escape routes through the nearby canyons. They are confident, Swift Eagle observed, studying the camp through a small telescope. Too confident. I count only 2 sentries, and they are not paying careful attention to their duties. Arrogance, Daniel said. They do not believe anyone would dare to challenge them this far from civilization. Then we will teach them otherwise, Swift Eagle replied grimly. As darkness fell, the warriors began moving into position around the mining camp. Daniel watched in fascination as they seemed to melt into the landscape, becoming invisible even when he knew exactly where they were supposed to be. Within 2 hours, the entire settlement was surrounded by a ring of silent observers who could strike from any direction at a moment's notice. The waiting began as the camp settled into its nighttime routine. Daniel could see figures moving around the buildings and hear occasional laughter or conversation carried on the night wind. Somewhere in those buildings, 3 young women were being held against their will, probably frightened and possibly injured. The thought made his anger burn hotter, though he forced himself to remain calm and focused on the mission ahead. It is time, Swift Eagle said quietly, as the first hint of dawn appeared in the eastern sky. Daniel checked his weapons one final time and joined the small negotiation party that would approach the camp under a white flag. In addition to Swift Eagle and himself, the group included 2 other war chiefs and a young warrior who spoke excellent English. They would present themselves as representatives of the local tribes, offering to purchase the freedom of the captives in exchange for safe passage out of the territory. As they rode down the slope toward the mining camp, Daniel felt his heart pounding with anticipation and fear. Everything depended on the next few minutes. If the criminals could be convinced to negotiate, the situation might be resolved without violence. If they chose to fight, people on both sides would probably die before the sun was fully risen. The sentries spotted them when they were still 100 yards from the camp, shouting warnings that brought armed figures rushing from the buildings. Daniel counted 6 men, just as Ayana had described, all carrying rifles and moving with the nervous energy of people who lived constantly on the edge of violence. "That is far enough," called a large man with yellow hair and facial scars that matched Ayana's description of the leader. "State your business or ride away." Swift Eagle raised the white flag higher and called back in clear English, "We come to talk, not to fight. We wish to discuss the release of the girls you are holding." The raider leader laughed harshly. "What girls? I do not know what you are talking about, Indian." "We know you have 3 Apache girls in your camp," Daniel called out, deciding to take a more direct approach. "We are prepared to offer fair compensation for their release." Well, the leader said, studying Daniel with interest. "A white man riding with Apache warriors. That is something you do not see every day. What is your interest in this matter, friend?" "Justice," Daniel replied simply. "Those girls were taken from their families by force. They deserve to be returned safely." "Justice," the leader repeated mockingly. "That is a fine word coming from someone who rides with savages. Tell me, friend, how much is this justice worth to you?" Swift Eagle and Daniel exchanged glances. The criminal was willing to negotiate, which was more than they had dared hope. If they could reach an agreement, the mission might be completed without bloodshed. "What do you want?" Swift Eagle asked. $500 in gold, the leader replied without hesitation. Each. It was an enormous sum, far more than most frontier families would see in a year. But Daniel had expected something like this, and he had come prepared. "We can pay," he said, pulling a leather pouch from his saddlebag. "But we want to see the girls first to make sure they are unharmed." The leader considered this for a moment, then gestured to one of his men. "Bring them out," he ordered. "But keep them close. These Indians might try something stupid." A few minutes later, 3 young women were led from one of the buildings. Daniel felt his heart sink as he saw their condition. All 3 showed signs of rough treatment, with torn clothing and bruises that suggested they had not been treated gently. The youngest, who could only be Kaya based on her resemblance to Ayana, appeared to be barely conscious and had to be supported by her captors. "As you can see, they are alive," the leader said with a cruel smile. "A bit worse for wear, perhaps, but still breathing." "You have harmed them," Swift Eagle said, his voice deadly quiet. "Nothing that will not heal," the leader replied dismissively. "Do we have a deal or not?" Daniel was about to agree when he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The youngest girl, Kaya, was not just exhausted or beaten. She was showing signs of severe illness, possibly pneumonia or infection from untreated injuries. Without immediate medical attention, she might not survive much longer. "The youngest girl is seriously ill," Daniel said urgently. "She needs medical care immediately." "That is not my problem," the leader replied coldly. "Pay the money and take them, or ride away and leave us in peace." It was at that moment that Daniel realized negotiation was not going to work. These men had no intention of releasing healthy captives who could testify about their treatment. They were planning to take the money and disappear, leaving behind evidence that could never speak against them. Daniel looked at Swift Eagle and saw the same realization in the war chief's eyes. The time for talking was over. "We will need a few minutes to count the money," Daniel said, buying time for the surrounding warriors to get into final position. "You have 5 minutes," the leader replied. "Then we conclude our business one way or another." Daniel and Swift Eagle rode back about 50 yards, ostensibly to organize the payment, but actually to signal the waiting warriors that negotiations had failed. A series of subtle hand gestures conveyed the message that the captives were in immediate danger, and that action was required. The attack came at sunrise, just as the golden light of dawn touched the tops of the surrounding mountains. It began with a sound like distant thunder, as nearly 100 warriors emerged from concealment simultaneously, their war cries echoing off the canyon walls. The raiders, caught completely off guard, barely had time to raise their weapons before they were overwhelmed by the sheer number of their attackers. The fighting lasted less than 10 minutes. When it was over, 3 of the criminals were dead, and the other 3 were prisoners, including their leader, who had taken an arrow through his shoulder, but survived. More importantly, all 3 captives had been rescued alive, though Kaya required immediate medical attention for the fever that was consuming her small body. Daniel found himself holding the sick girl as Ayanna wept with relief at being reunited with her sister. Swift Eagle and his warriors had handled the situation with remarkable restraint, using only the force necessary to secure the captives and neutralize the threat. It was a far cry from the savage violence that frontier newspapers often attributed to Apache war parties. "Is it over?" Ayanna asked, looking around at the aftermath of the brief battle. "It is over," Swift Eagle confirmed. "These men will face tribal justice for their crimes, and word will be sent to other such bands that the Apache people are not helpless victims to be preyed upon." As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the war party began to disperse as quickly as it had assembled. The surviving criminals were taken away to face judgment before a council of tribal elders, while the rescued girls were prepared for the journey home. Daniel knew that he would probably never learn the exact fate of the raiders, but he was confident that justice would be served according to Apache law. The return journey to Daniel's ranch took 2 days, with frequent stops to allow Kaya to rest and recover from her ordeal. Daniel used his medical knowledge to treat her fever and infections, while Ayanna provided the emotional support that only a sister could offer. Gradually, the young woman's strength returned, though it would be weeks before she fully recovered from her traumatic experience. When they finally reached the ranch, Daniel was surprised to find Swift Eagle and a small group of warriors waiting for them. The war chief had traveled ahead to prepare for their arrival and to discuss the future relationship between the Apache bands and their white neighbor. "You have proven yourself to be a true friend to our people," Swift Eagle said as they gathered around Daniel's kitchen table. "What you did required great courage and sacrifice. How can we repay such a debt?" "There is no debt," Daniel replied. "We were fighting for the same thing, justice and the protection of innocent people. Nevertheless, you have earned the respect and gratitude of all our bands," Swift Eagle insisted. "From this day forward, you will be considered family by the Apache people. Your ranch will be under our protection, and your cattle will graze safely on these lands." It was an extraordinary honor, one that would fundamentally change Daniel's relationship with his native neighbors. He would no longer be simply a friendly white rancher, but an adopted member of the Apache community with all the rights and responsibilities that entailed. As the tribal delegation prepared to depart, Ayanna approached Daniel with tears in her eyes. "I do not know how to thank you for what you have done," she said. "You saved my life, rescued my sister, and helped our people when they needed it most." "You do not need to thank me," Daniel replied. "You brought something into my life that I had lost long ago, a sense of purpose and connection to something larger than myself." "What will happen now?" Ayanna asked. "Will you continue to live alone on this ranch?" Daniel looked around at his property, seeing it with new eyes. The isolation that had once been a refuge now seemed less appealing than it had before. He had remembered what it felt like to care about other people, to be part of a community that valued honor and mutual support. "I do not think I will be alone anymore," he said thoughtfully. "Swift Eagle has invited me to visit the tribal camps, and I think I would like to learn more about Apache culture and traditions. Perhaps I can find ways to build bridges between our peoples." Ayana smiled at this answer. "And perhaps you will find other things as well. A man who shows such courage and compassion should not spend his life in solitude." As the Apache party finally departed, Daniel stood on his porch, watching them disappear into the vast landscape that had shaped both their lives. The silence that descended over his ranch was different from the lonely quiet he had known before. It was the comfortable silence of someone who knew he was part of something larger, who had found his place in the complex web of relationships that defined life on the frontier. The sun was setting behind the distant mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. Somewhere out there, 3 young women were safely reunited with their families, and a band of criminals had faced justice for their actions. It had been a good day's work, the kind that made a man proud of the choices he had made. As Daniel prepared for sleep that night, he reflected on the events that had transformed his quiet life into something far more meaningful. He had hidden a native girl from raiders, and in doing so had discovered that his true calling was not as a solitary rancher, but as a bridge between 2 worlds that needed each other more than they realized. The future stretched before him, full of possibilities he had never considered during his years of self-imposed exile. There would be new challenges and new opportunities to serve the cause of justice and understanding. And perhaps, if he was very fortunate, there would be companions to share the journey. The lonely rancher who had once sought only solitude had found something far more valuable: a family, a purpose, and a place in the great story of the American frontier where courage and compassion could triumph over hatred and fear.